Hello, today I'm going to talk about how not to suck at PowerPoint. I thought I'd record this live because it's a presentation. Let's talk about presenting. So let's talk about the difference between digital presentations and doing normal on-the-board analog presentations. So a digital presentation, more than most presentations, is a sequential arrangement of words and images. And that means, to a large degree, depending on the medium you're choosing, you have to prearrange the images and the text that you're going to show people, and generally you're presenting them one after another in a predetermined sequence. So just like I'm showing you now, when I hit the next button on my laptop, you see the image that I've arranged in advance. So that means you have to kind of plan it out and show it in a particular sequence, as opposed to presentation boards when you can show the whole thing at once and then walk the audience through in the sequence that you choose on the moment. So here's a set of presentation boards. In the example on the screen at the moment, you can see 3 A2 boards, and the designer of these boards strung them together so that they do have a linear flow to them. And so when we have a look at them, we can see the details. And we can imagine in a live presentation walking through from left to right. But the difference is that we can call the audience attention to any part of this presentation at any time. And indeed, the audience can look at whatever they like. We can't limit what they're looking at. And so they might be looking at a particularly interesting rendering at the end of the presentation when we're talking about the beginning. So there are differences to these approaches, and we need to master those differences and make sure we use them appropriately. Mostly we need to choose the images and how we arrange it to suit the medium that we're using. So let's look at the differences between presentation boards and digital presentations. So with presentation boards, you definitely want to have a finite number of boards. So you know the cost of each board. There's a literal cost and a time cost. So the time it takes to design the board, actually put the content together is one thing, and also printing out those boards, or at least the cost of the materials used in those boards, imposes a penalty, a cost on you. In a digital presentation, adding another slide, adding another screen costs you nothing, apart from the time it takes to create those images. In presentation boards, as I mentioned a minute ago, images, you see them all at once in most cases, although I suppose it's possible to put things up selectively. It's probably a little bit impractical in many situations. In digital presentations, you see the images, or at least the arrangement of the images, as you dictate, one at a time. In presentation boards, the distance is variable. That is to say, you can walk up to a presentation board and see more detail. Or you can step back and see large images from a distance. In a digital presentation, that's a fixed distance. So when you design your presentation, you have to do the zooming in for the viewer when you want to show more detail. Presentation boards, good composition is essential. So you have many elements, many bits of information that you need to arrange in a pleasing manner. And you also need to arrange that presentation so that the eye is led through in the order that you want. And this is why we talk about things like hero boards and hero images, and talking about them being dominant in the presentation. That dominance causes the eye to go to them first. It causes them to command the view of the viewer, and that's a way of controlling the sequence that the viewer gets the information to help them assimilate it. In a digital presentation, we've got complete control of the sequence, and so the audience can't see what's coming until we show it to them. So we have a lot more control, but we also have a lot more responsibility to plan how they get those images. So it's really important that we design these forms of communication to suit the medium. And because I'm talking about digital presentations today, I'm really talking about how it's different when we're using screen-based media, as we are in this example. So it's important that we don't treat digital presentations like presentation boards. So it's a temptation for many people when they start planning their board layouts to think of a digital screen having perhaps different dimensions, different proportions, but thinking of it like an A2 presentation board where we have to arrange different elements in different portions of the screen. That is not the case. With a digital presentation, we really want to show one idea at a time. And that idea is often going to be one image, although multiple images are quite possible. And so it's quite a different way of organizing the information. So let's talk about some tips for arranging digital presentations. So firstly, keep it simple. There are many ways of thinking about this. You want to use layout features wisely. Now, one of the first things you do when you get your hands on PowerPoint or Keynote, depending on what you're using, is that this software will give you features that you don't necessarily want to use. So the default slides that you get in something like PowerPoint will give you the title of the file on the corner of the page and the slide number. Now, this is actually pretty irrelevant to the audience. If the audience, well, the audience don't need to know how many slides are in your deck. They only need to focus on your message. So the number of slides is irrelevant, and it's also easy to throw out when you add slides for animation or intermediate steps. It's irrelevant information. Likewise, the presentation title, if they're paying attention, they know what you're talking about. If they haven't been paying attention, putting the title on the slide isn't going to help. All right, so my advice is to take these things off and keep the screen very minimal and focused on the content. So as I said here, content is king. Also, use animations wisely. Use animations to enhance the meaning of the presentation. PowerPoint, Keynote, all of these things have quite complex animations possible. And it can feel like being a little bit of a kid in a candy shop where you've got all these options and you want to try them all, savor them all. The reality is that many of those animations can be distracting, and they can drag you out of the moment and draw your attention more to the presentation itself rather than the content of the presentation. So as an old dead guy once said, everything should be as simple as possible, but not simpler. So that means not oversimplifying. We don't want things simplistic, we want them simple. Quite a difference. Second thing I want to say is that images are of primary importance. Images are king in this kind of thing. So you want to let the images do the talking. My advice is generally to spread the images to the limits of the screen at every opportunity. That won't be the case in every case. Sometimes, for example, in this, you want to show some text. On this screen, I want to show some text, minimum visuals, maximum visuals, minimal text. So I want to show some text and I want to show an image, but wherever possible you want to make the image as important as it can be. So when you're showing, say, the hero shot of your product, can you make it fit the screen? So can you, instead of having a frame around it, can you get rid of all that stuff and make the image as large as possible on the screen? That gives it greater impact. And it also emphasizes that the image is the thing that we're talking about. It's the only thing to look at. So we don't need fancy layouts. We don't need fancy decoration in the slides. The content's king. That's the thing we want to look at. Now, I mentioned a minute ago that we should minimize text, and there's a very practical reason for that, and that's this. Never use a sentence when a couple of words will tell the story. Remember, words add emphasis. You tell the story. Too many words and people will be reading instead of listening to you. All right, so when I put whole sentences like this up, the audience scans ahead, reads the sentence, and my voice becomes actually a bit of a distraction. Then you have to refocus on the presenter. So instead, focus on just a few key words. So this is a bad slide. This is a better slide. So the words are there to emphasize the story you're telling, the story you're communicating. The images are doing most of that work, and you, as the live presenter, are emphasizing aspects of it. So what I like to do in my presentation is I put keywords on the screen. I don't put sentences on the screen if I can possibly avoid it. And so the audience is listening to what I'm saying, and the words are emphasizing my message, not the other way around, so to speak. Logical sequence. As I mentioned at the outset, having a sequence of images is super important in this. So knowing what you're going to do ahead of time, you can't skip around the slides once the presentation is underway. Well, you can't skip around the slides and look professional. So you really want to have this stuff planned out in advance. And so really that's about having a memorable introduction, a memorable conclusion, and a cogent argument that strings those 2 points together. So in a design presentation, that introduction is about describing the needs of the project, the design brief in a sense, and the conclusion is the details of the product. And what you get in between are why it makes sense, the features and the reason for the features, given the time that you have available. Now, in many design presentations, we might start with the hero board, but in a digital presentation, you might actually have to start with establishing the design brief. When we have the hero board in a pin-up presentation, we can jump to the middle of it and talk about the sequence of use before we start talking about the hero if we want to. We need to think about that a little bit more with a digital presentation. So what's a cogent argument? Well, it's really about leading the audience through why this is a good design, why it makes sense. And so it's giving them enough information to realize how clever you are and how successful you are as a designer. So it's about telling us just the essential stuff we need to do that. We must remember at this point that in a limited presentation time, if you only have 5 or 10 minutes time, you don't have time to tell the story of the whole history of your thinking. You have to focus on what you've actually ended up with. So it's really about the absolutely crucial bits in establishing this as a successful design. Oh, by the way, don't oversell it. You don't want to gloss over issues and flaws. Every design is a compromise. It's about placing value on certain aspects of the design solution and acknowledging sometimes that other values are not as well accommodated. But focus on the positive. Don't gloss over the negative, but don't ignore them. I mentioned using the features of your software. Meaningful animation is pretty important. And so just to draw your attention to what's happening on these slides, I've been using a series of animations between the content. If I skip back a bit, you can see that rolling up to a next section and rolling sideways for more detail is the way I've been arranging the animations in this sequence. So I use the direction of slide and zooming and zooming out to add emphasis so we've just gone to another section, so it's scrolled up. So that's the way I've done it in this presentation. You don't have to do it in every presentation that way, but have logic for your animation and you'll enhance the meaning of your message. Don't forget the basics. The most important basic is connecting. So I keep looking at the camera and I'm doing that to maintain eye contact with my audience who are watching this on a recording. In a class situation, I'd be glancing around at the people who are actually watching and trying to maintain eye contact with them and helping draw them in. And you'll find that actually looking at people's eyes makes it easier for them to pay attention. Eye contact builds rapport. And you want rapport with your audience because you want something from them in most cases. In many cases, you're presenting your design because you want their support in making the design happen. In the uni situation, you're presenting your design because you want the marks, I guess. But establishing that connection with your audience through eye contact is really important. Pacing is really important as well. It's very common for students to go into the presentation in preparation thinking, how the hell am I going to fill 5 or 10 minutes allotted to me? And they start packing the presentation with a lot of content. When the presentation starts, they realize that the pace that you can speak things is much slower than the pace that you can read things. So what looks like a short presentation when you look at it on your screen beforehand turns out to take quite a long time to present. This is one of the reasons why we recommend that you rehearse a presentation by speaking it aloud before you give it. A good way to do this is by setting up your phone, just the way I've done here, perhaps in your bedroom or your living room, and actually recording you presenting and just rehearse that presentation. And if you can stand it, watch it back. And you'll see where you feel that it's rushed and where it seems to be lagging a little bit. But rehearsing helps you work out the time. Recording lets you see how long it took because you can see the length of the recording. It's very easy to take much longer than you expected. So pacing is pretty important. Now you'll see that while I'm presenting, I keep glancing down to the left here. That's where my laptop is. And I'm looking at a different display than what's appearing on the screen. So on the screen, this is what the audience sees. on my laptop, I can see the presenter's view. And this is what the presenter's view looks like to me during a presentation. Essentially, there's what the projector is seeing and what the presenter is seeing on the laptop screen. Ideally, you'd have the laptop in front of you between the audience and you. And so you can glance down and see what slide is coming up next very easily. This helps you avoid the situation where you're talking about content from the next slide in the current slide, because you know it's coming up, but you've forgotten the exact sequence or the exact slide that's going to be attending it. So using Presenter's Display, which is available, this is the Keynote presenter display on a Mac. PowerPoint has a different arrangement, but the same information. In fact, PowerPoint has a bit more information. It shows you a whole lot of the next slides in the presenter's display, so it gives you a little bit more to cope with, but also more information. So the presenter's display, if you're using a laptop, is quite helpful. So this is what the presenter's display looks like in a bit more detail. Current slide, the next slide. You can also show notes that the audience don't see, so you can have the prompts. You can have these notes appear much larger than you can see in this slide. So this is the kind of stuff I was meaning to talk about when this was on the screen. And you also see timers running, which show your elapsed time and the current time, the clock. So this stuff is customizable. You can add and subtract from it, and it's pretty useful. Finally, you should have a slide or at least a time in your presentation for questions. Now, you might entertain questions from the audience during the presentation, but there are occasions when that's not so good because that interrupts the flow that you've predetermined. So one of the things that you can do is ask people, when people ask you a question during your presentation, you can choose to answer it, or because you're in control, you can say, thanks for that, I will answer that, I'll address that point in a slide that's coming up. So if you can just hold on, I'm happy to answer it again if I didn't clarify it during the presentation. So take control, exercise control over the audience, and if you're not happy with the question at that place, put it off till later. Another thing that you can do to make questions easier is you can anticipate the things that you probably want on the screen to show during the questions. So one way of doing this is to have question time slides. And in many cases when I do this, I have duplicates of slides I used earlier in the presentation. So I just duplicate the slide and have a copy of it after the end of the presentation. Seems weird to have slides after the end, but basically these are optional slides. They're things that I think I might need to have on the screen when people are asking me questions. And in many design presentations, it'll be a hero image. It'll be your best image of the final design, or perhaps some of the research, because those are things you're probably going to have questions about. For example, in the ritual project, you might have questions about details you didn't have time to cover, such as sustainability, manufacturing, or materials selections. You might have that after the end so that you can respond to questions more easily. One more thing I wanted to talk about, which I forgot to put in the presentation. You saw what I just did. I retraced my steps. That's a bit jarring, isn't it? It kind of breaks the audience out of the presentation. So it's much better to have those after end of slide presentation, those question slides all queued up. But the final thing I wanted to say is about the pacing, about trying to get a good solid pacing so you don't go too fast, don't go too quickly for the audience, and you don't bore the audience. And this is also related to engaging the audience. For example, varying your voice, not speaking with a flat voice, but trying to show interest and enthusiasm. You need to be enthusiastic about your presentation. If you're not enthusiastic, why should anyone in the audience care about your design? So I'm talking about enthusiasm, not insanity. So you don't want to be kind of crazy about it, but you want to be clearly invested in that. And in relation to pacing, remember to use pauses. So pauses are a great way of breaking up the rhythm and emphasizing parts of the presentation. So what happens with a pause is that people want to know what comes next. And that expectation, that tease, is actually quite powerful. You don't have to do it in such an obvious way as I just did it then, but try it in your presentation, make a statement, and count to 3 in your mind and let it sink in. and see how that feels. It's quite empowering. Anyway, remember, rehearse, get things in the order that makes sense, and take control of the presentation. Be in command. It's your responsibility, and it's also your right. So enjoy your presentations. The more you do them, the more confident you'll get, the more relaxed you'll feel delivering them, and yeah, I guess you'll get people excited about your ideas. Good luck.